Summon the clans and bring out the damaged Kron, because by Grimnir there are grudges to be settled and lost holds to be reconquered. We jump into our dwarf guide with the High King himself, Thorgrim Grudgebearer. This Dowie Lord brings with himself reductions in construction costs for military buildings and reduced upkeep for longbeards and hammers, greatly improving his ability to field both early and late game armies. His starting roster of the hammerers, quarrelers, and grudge throwers should make short work of any grobby scum that dare stand against him. Carried aloft into battle by his shield bearers, Thorgrim need not worry about being ignominiously thrown about, allowing him to support his army against all comers. Next up, we have the Lord of Carrick Kadrin, the Slayer King, Ungrim Ironfist. A powerful, unbreakable close-quarters combatant, he brings with him significant upkeep and recruitment cost reductions for Slayers, and between his Longbeards, Thunderers, and Slayers, none can stand against him. Finally, we are met by the Dwarf, the Legend, the Games Workshop figurehead, Grumbrindle, the White Dwarf. Easily one of the most powerful starting lords in the game, his campaign map buffs apply to all armies on the field, as he inspires your Davi to crush all before them. Although the improvements to his underway and reinforcement range may seem lackluster, they greatly improve quality of life, and the powers of the Ancestor Gods can provide a significant boost, especially in the all-too-crucial early game. Finally, Iron Drakes, Miners with Blasting Charges, and Gyrocopter Bombs will make short work of all manner of soft enemies you face. And with their powerful Brimstone guns, the Dowie Air Corps can make killing enemy lords far easier. So gather around, beardlings, drink some stout dwarven ale, and listen to my tale as we march to war for the Karazhan Corps. So we find ourselves here on the World's Edge Mountains at the start of the Dwarvish campaign, and yeah, very far out of the way, all the way on the eastern fringes of the Old World map. And I have chosen Grombrindle here, and first and foremost I want to discuss some of the strengths and weaknesses of the Dwarves. Amongst their strengths is, well, first and foremost, position. They start in a spot where they can, unless the player is incredibly aggressive or poorly plans, you can keep all of your fighting on one front. And this is a huge benefit. Other factions like Greenskins, Empire, even Vampire counts are surrounded by enemies and potential enemies who will often pressure you and attack you. That is not true for Dwarves. Simply put, you have allies or potential allies on your left flank, mountains and allies to your north. Your only enemies are, and of course, the border of the map on the all the way on the east. So really, once you've cleared out the Silver Road, there's not much you have to worry about from the outside of the south. You simply push southward. It also means you're fairly well positioned to confederate early. You're you can easily defend yourself. You're fairly well positioned to trade as soon as you confederate Barak Var, especially since you'll get access to an early harbor. And you're also benefited by the fact that you're starting off against Greenskins, and Greenskins, especially under AI management, are absolutely pitiful. They are very squishy, their morale is terrible even on high difficulties, and they will very easily break and fall apart against the Dwarves, so that's definitely one of the big advantages of starting position. That your starting opponents are very weak, especially when compared to the Dwarves' strong early game, which is another benefit. The Dwarves have very strong early game units and economy. Their economy is one of the strongest in the game, and can easily be boosted not just with economy buildings, but with several unique economy buildings such as gem mine shafts and gold mines, as well as some unique structures such as harbors in Barak Var or the Brightstone mine in Gunbad, so on and so forth. Breweries, that sort of thing. Then, of course, the early game units are very strong. Dwarves are probably one of the only factions that can easily get by on just their tier 1 and 2 units, potentially. And definitely with tier 3 is the tier where they really get most of the units that they'll be using for the rest of the game. Most of their tier 4 and 5 units are a little more than just spicing up your armies or making them more entertaining or testing out silly things. Really, the core of your army is going to be tier 2 and 3 units, and you don't really need to go much past that. And they also have early access to artillery, which is incredibly useful in the early game. When it allows you to just crush enemy hordes of infantry very, very efficiently. Combined with the Dwarves' very stoic and almost unbreakable front line, and they're very strong skirmishers in the form of the Quarrelers, who have shields. And the Dwarves are just an absolute monster army in the early game. They also have strong lords, not just Grombrindle, who is an absolutely ridiculous melee combatant, but even Thorgrim, of course, Ungrim, and normal dwarf lords and even rune lords are solid melee combatants and provides a very significant boost to their armies. They also have a very strong tech tree, which is with options for all sorts of income, growth, public order, anti-corruption, and of course generic army tech. And they have a lot of different variations of tech, and all of the tech is fairly it's fairly easy to research, which makes them very powerful early game. And none of it requires specific buildings. Almost none of it requires money. Only the rat poison does. So all in all, the dwarves can get a very powerful economy, very powerful upgrades fairly efficiently. That's definitely a big boon for them. Finally, they do have a handful of unique buildings, and they do have access to the underway, which allows them to bypass terrain, as you can see here. If I change to the underway, I'm actually too far away from the mountains, but it does allow you to pass under terrain if you're close enough to the terrain. Or if, and it basically allows you to go anywhere in a sighted circle. You can be intercepted in the underway, or intercept opponents trying to use the underway, and the dwarves are absolutely ideal for that because it turns the battle into a narrow frontage on a road, and dwarves obviously profit greatly from that because their whole army is built around being a defensive box or line. You can just hold their ground and wreck their enemies that way. Now, and of course, underway allows you to be immune to attrition, which is incredibly useful. Now, the dwarves do have a handful of weaknesses. The units have relatively high upkeep. They can't really. You probably won't want to rely on your units as much as the Empire can. So you'll end up with some more high end, or because you'll be running more high end armies probably. Since dwarves get very good. You can run low tier armies with dwarves, but you can also. Their high end is they have much better higher end infantry than the Empire does. So they'll have higher upkeep usually. Their growth is very slow, and this can make it difficult to build your cities past tier 3. Slow unit replenishment on top of that. Grudges, which are a bit of a double-edged sword. They can give you decent amounts of profit if you're able to shut down the sword, or settle the grudge very quickly, but if you're not, then it can fester and stack and eventually increase fairly significant public order penalties if you allow it to go unchecked, especially in early game. Dwarves also have fairly weak provincial commandments, or at least they need both the public order one and growth, and you end up being forced to choose either or, which can be a bit of a downside. And finally, as mentioned, their late game units are a bit lackluster. They're not necessarily useless, but they're not as efficient. Most of them are not particularly crucial or important to use. They have no access to cavalry. The dwarves are very slow. Besides gyrocopters, which are very niche, most of the late tier units are niche, and that makes them fairly useless. So dwarves can basically get by in tier 3. Finally, so with that out of the way, let's go over objectives real quick. Dwarves' main objectives, assuming you're going for long victory, is to clear out all the grudges in the Great Book of Grudges. Grudges are triggered whenever the enemy somehow wrongs you, whether that's defeating an army, raising or occupying a city, raiding your territory, enemy hero actions, that sort of thing. Basically anything that wrongs you will trigger a grudge, and you'll have to somehow settle it. Then you need to reconquer all of the major dwarven settlements across the map, and several orcish ones, several dwarven settlements that are now controlled by the orcs. You have to destroy the orcs, of course, and defeat the Warriors of Chaos and the Warhorde of Chaos. That's kind of your generic campaign objectives. And then on to the legendary lords. I would strongly recommend starting off with Brindle because of his global boosts on his campaign effect line. Commerce isn't too important. Trade usually isn't the biggest source of income for most factions, but of course, Lightning Strike is very nice, but main thing is he gets access to several upgrades that simply improve all his armies across the board, whether that be campaign movement speed, replenishment, recruitment costs, unit experience, or, well, this is for him, global recruitment capacity, but still, some very strong global upgrades, and these apply to everything, which makes them incredibly powerful. Grumbrindle himself, very powerful melee lord. You can do Ungrim or Thorgrim. They can be fun in their own right, but they're definitely not as good as Grumbrindle, objectively speaking. Ungrim especially suffers because Slayers are a very niche, limited use unit, and so having them being fairly cheap is not the most useful thing. Plus they're a tier 4 unit, so it takes a while to get access to them, and that's just unfortunate. Now, priority, of course, should be the conquest of Silver Road, so that you can unite your initial province, and following that, I would recommend confederating with Barak Var. Usually they will have lost the battle with the Greenskins around this point, around turn 5, 6 or so. You can confederate them. From there, you will want to expand southward and take control of the Blood River Valley and take control of Death Pass, most importantly shutting down Black Crag, and that way denying greenskins access to the gold mines there. That is absolutely crucial. It will also improve your economy. You want to be building fortifications and economy building, your income buildings in every settlement, the toolmaker's workshop, or trinket maker's shop, and of course walls. However, in the push of Grungni, I would generally leave a growth building initially, or build a growth building initially, so that way you can quickly attain tier 3. As I said, the dwarves' growth is very slow, so you want to get to tier 3 as quickly as you possibly can. Otherwise, standard building layout. Later on, you might want to move your mustering hall or your barracks building out. In early game with dwarves, I would recommend building a siege workshop, getting a few grudge throwers up and running, and then selling it and replacing it with a gem mineshaft after you've equipped 1 or 2 armies with artillery. Now, for dwarf lords in early game, now Grumbrindle has some fairly most of his items are generic, and both Ungrim and Thorgrim share similar battle effect traits. Improving your Quarrelers, your Thunderers. I will not be going over Belegar here, because I will do a separate video for Angrind in the near future, which will just detail some of the more nuanced aspects of playing Angrind, simply like their early game strats, really, because their late game, of course, is very similar to Dwarves. So I'll be going over Angrind at a later point. Just a disclaimer there. So Grumbrindle, and of course, the main difference is that Thorgrim has a sort of frenzy ability, where when he's below 50% leadership, he provides all units with frenzy. And Ungrim has a slight upgrade to Slayer melee attack up in this character stat bar, which improves all his Slayers. And Grumbrindle trades Stand Your Ground and Hold Your Ground, I do believe, for Mighty Beard of Defense and Flash Bomb, which are much better abilities. But otherwise, you have some very nice early game abilities here. The dwarf bottom line is, I'll actually recruit a lord here just to demonstrate a few things. If you do, now you have 2 options with dwarf lords, and I'll go over that real quickly. You can do a rune lord or a generic dwarf lord. I'm actually going to get a rune lord here because he has some unique abilities on his army tech tree. Now, if you get a rune lord, he does share most of the tech with Belegar, or most of his army battle effects with Belegar. A rune lord is much more oriented to a low tier army. He takes much longer to tech up, so generally I would recommend normal dwarf lords early on, because they're very powerful right out of the gate, and then perhaps building some rune lords later on. Rune lords are much better synced though with a lower tier army, with rangers and generic dwarf warriors and miners, because they don't have the same options for to upgrade iron breakers or longbeards or hammers that the other lords or the other dwarf heroes get. But they can get very powerful rangers, especially if you combo them with a engineer, with a dwarf engineer. This is absolutely ridiculous, the amount of damage their rangers can do. But otherwise, rally, as you go, it's called rally there, you can see, and then stand your ground. So those are the standard upgrades for the lords there. And then Miner's Instinct is a very useful trait, I found. It can help you intercept beastmen and those annoying beastmen and greenskin armies that will just kind of tunnel around in the outer way and trying to escape you and waste your time as you're chasing them around everywhere. This is a good way to counter that, simply because they can't escape you. You'll intercept them and slaughter them in the underway. And if you beat them in the underway, they're automatically annihilated. Lightning Strike, of course, is very useful, and Inquiring Mind, which is available for all dwarf lords again, or all types of dwarf lords, except for Grumbrindle. Very powerful. Extra research rate means that you can get your tech even quicker. But once again, rune lords do take a while to get up and running properly, so do be aware of that. Now, once you've conquered Silver Road, general building layout we discussed. You want your money and defensive buildings everywhere, and then fill the last slot with either growth early on, maybe control improvements, so that your public order in the province is better, or barracks in some cases. Early game tech for dwarves, I would recommend, if you're playing on higher difficulties, especially public order and improved income. If you're playing on lower difficulties, you can probably get away with just doing military tech, because your public order won't suffer nearly as much. And the grudges are not that terrible, especially later in the game. You can basically ignore them and have crumbling severity, so keep that in mind. Now, early game comp for dwarves, what I would recommend is, barring any starting units like this, I would recommend basically a front line of all dwarf warriors, probably about 8 or 9 of them, just making up about half your army, then about 6 quarrelers, and then 4 artillery pieces with generally either 4 grudge throwers or 2 grudge throwers and 2 bolt throwers would be my recommendation. And basically you play as a defensive box and use your artillery pieces to win you the battle and your skirmishers. So definitely something to keep in mind. Definitely something my recommended comp for early game. Don't bother with dwarf great weapons. In my opinion, they're not worth it. The quarrels with great weapons are absolutely useless because you want your shields to protect you against enemy ranged fire. Shields are the best defense against ranged fire, not armor. And you want and dwarf warriors with great weapons or all units with great weapons are only really useful if you want an army that's dedicated for siege work, because skirmish units are not particularly good at sieges. But neither are artillery is not particularly good at sieges either. And dwarf warriors don't have the greatest melee attack, or melee, neither do longbeards. So if you need to fight a siege, or you want an army specifically built for sieging, that's when you would take great weapons. Otherwise, I would stick to normal warriors and normal longbeards just to hold the line. Now, once you've conquered all this northern front, you can potentially go up and take Gunbad. If Zufbar hasn't taken it yet, you can get a Brightstone mine up there and get money, or additional money that way. Otherwise, you basically just expand south. You can expand on multiple fronts, because you should be able to afford multiple armies if your economy is up and running like it should be. You can confederate Carcassonne over here, which will give you a further boost. Carcassonne just runs the whole eastern rim of this area. Crush the orcs, take over the Badlands, and at this stage, this should probably be around turn 60, 70 or so. You basically have covered your entire back line. It means you can turn this into an economic powerhouse. Make sure to mop up any revolts that occur. Do be careful about keeping your control high and making sure not to allow your public order to get out of control, because that could be absolutely ludicrous. And having to shut down a boatload of revolts can be very straining. You definitely don't want to do that. If you have access to heroes, make sure you take advantage of them, especially if you can get growth going. Runesmith's going to improve your provincial growth, so definitely very useful ability there. Do try to be friendly with all the other dwarves, and of course the border princes. The border prince is going to be one of your main sources of trade and income. Once you've mopped up the greenskins, make sure to fortify Granty Mingle and Gorkazan. At very least, you should really fortify all your cities, but especially these two, because when the Chaos Invasion does come, you're going to have Bjornlings coming in from the south, and they have about 4 or 5 armies, I do believe. And as long as you have an army in Gorgazan and Granty Mingle, you should be fine. You should be able to defeat him pretty handily. But do keep that in mind. Don't just abandon this area, otherwise you'll be forced to scrounge up an army last second and possibly have to retake these areas later if they get raised. And once you're prepared for the Bjornlings, you can basically take all of your armies and just go straight north. You can try to confederate Angren, that sort of thing. Of course, at that point you have plenty of options as to what you can do. You can always underway over to the border princes if you're friendly with them. That sort of thing. There's not much to prepare for the Chaos Invasion, because usually the Chaos Invasion is not going straight for you. It's wasting its time crushing Kislev, crushing Vampire Counts, crushing Empire, all these other factions that are in the way. So you don't have to worry about it too much. You just have to worry about the Bjornlings in the south. And after that, after you've cleared the southeast corner, you're basically free to do whatever you want. Confederate whoever you want, expand however you want. So I'm going to move on over to a later stage of the game. I discussed some of the later game issues with dwarves and what you want to be doing with them there. So here we are in a late game situation. As you can see, most of the world's mine, whatever isn't, is either unoccupied or under the control of the border princes. So just really quick, going to be going over, first and foremost, heroes. The Runesmith, very powerful hero, can improve your growth in a province if you wish. Otherwise, he's basically a mini Rune Lord, buffing your nearby units or hitting enemies with the Rune of Wrath and Ruin. He provides its half bonus or half effect, I believe, of the Rune Lord. It's just a very solid hero option there. Your other options are the Master Engineer. Interestingly enough, he reduces enemy ammo when deployed in an enemy province. So he can be pretty nasty when used against Empire or Wood Elves or factions that allow a lot of skirmishers. Otherwise, he has some very significant buffs to his factions, to his army's artillery and missile damage and ammunition count and all those sorts of things. He can improve his speed for his artillery and missile units. Combined with Rangers, he can be incredibly powerful, because especially when he's joined with the Rune Lord. Finally, with the Thane, who's your generic sort of combat lord. He can provide a public order boost. Oh yeah, the Master Engineer, when deployed in a local province, improves your or reduces the cost to build buildings. Thane improves public order when deployed in a local province, reduces enemy public order, can assault enemy units, which can be useful for weakening their armies. And it's just a very strong combat lord, as well as able to provide inspirational, reduce recruitment costs, or improve unit experience. It's a very strong support lord. Support hero. The dwarves don't get a dedicated assassin hero though, unfortunately, unlike the witch hunter or big boss or banshee. So do keep that in mind. That is definitely a bit of a disadvantage for them. It can make it hard to shut down annoying chaos heroes. So in general, to counter chaos heroes, I would instead recommend relying on a mix of your Venerate the Ancestors commandment, and possibly picking up, actually Grumbrindle won't have that, potentially picking up, if you feel like it, Purebeard, and of course Slayer Shrines. Now, handful of things. In late game, dwarves, you will probably be teching into military technologies rather than economy. And more importantly, dwarf recruiting is incredibly slow. Their global recruiting and their local recruiting, which can definitely be a bit of a challenge for them. So they can't recruit in one turn like Empire can with its cheap units. It takes them a while to get their higher end units done recruiting. As you can see, 6 turns for Iron Drakes, 4 turns for Hammers and Iron Breakers. Just very long and very difficult. So that's definitely a bit of a problem for dwarves. So be ready to take a while to build up new armies. Definitely not instant recruiting new hordes like Empire, for example, can, or let alone Wood Elves, for example. You can increase your global recruitment capacity, of course, by building the Runeforge, but that is a very expensive structure, so that can be a bit of a challenge. And a very expensive structure, and a structure that requires tier 5, so by the time you have access to it, it's often very late in the game. For army, though, for army comp in late game, I would recommend something similar to this. Obviously, the Iron Drakes and Gyrocopters are carryovers from early game. Normally, I'd probably replace them with like 2 units of Quarrelers, because against enemies, Quarrelers are better against enemy skirmishers than Thunderers are. But otherwise, cannons for your artillery arm should replace Grudge Throws. Basically, the best of both worlds between combining Grudge Throw's accuracy and shell velocity with the greater damage and ability against large clumps of the Grudge Thrower, all while doing more damage more damage than both. Not quite as effective as the Grudge Thrower at killing off enemy infantry, but pretty close. Just very solid all-arounder unit with the cannon. And generic Longbeards, just to give you that crazy front line with their high melee defense, high melee defense, high armor, decent melee attack. Just very solid unit all around. Definitely not something to be underestimated. You can, of course, get access to Belegar if you Confederate Angrand, so definitely keep that in mind. The dwarves do have access to a handful of unique structures, which I'll try to find real quick. There's not many of them. They have the Throne Hall of the High King, the Brights, which is just a general across-the-board faction buff for public order, income, and some unit experience, Lord Recruit rank, that sort of stuff. Definitely not bad. The Brightstone Mine in Mount Gunbad, which is a unique income building, but also improves your artillery recruit in the province and provides a small garrison. Plus improves trade, which once again is not the best source of income. Zufbar, nothing actually. Karakadrin, though, does have access to the Great Slayer Shrine. And other than that, the dwarves have several unique, or not unique, but several places that have an arsenal, or a gunpowder, or a saltpeter, I do believe mine, which allows them to improve either their melee units in case the arsenal or the gunpowder hall or whatever it is will improve their, which I think they have one of them down south here. Yeah, here we go. Powder hall, which will improve their black powder units. So definitely not bad for the dwarves. And they have several unique income structures they can get, of course, around breweries, which are scattered around several places. And possibly, well, definitely more importantly, they can get access to gold mines, which can generate immense amounts of money. As you can see, 1,800 on the tier 4 ones. And diamond mines, which generate diamonds. So Crack-a-Drac with 900 income and gemstones being produced, which is huge when you're trading. So definitely some stuff you want to keep in mind. Dwarves have access to several of these sorts of structures scattered all over the map. So always be on the lookout for them. Otherwise, there's not much to say for dwarves. That is basically their late game. Their late game, you're basically just steadily pushing out, crushing anybody in your path. When you're fighting chaos, I can't recommend like a specific front line of fortifications where you're going to fight, because it's basically going to depend on the game. Sometimes Chaos will push. When you're Empire, you're always the Bulwark of the North. You're ready to go. But again, when you're Dwarves, Empire can come, or the Chaos can get stopped at Kislev and not make it at all, and you'll end up fighting at Karak Ungor, or maybe they'll just drive you south, and by the time you actually run into it, by the time you've confederated at Karak Hern or Zufbar, you're going to be fighting him on top of Miguel Vongabarak or Karak Dromar or Karak Hern or one of these settlements. Sometimes they'll fight him around Karak Norn. It's a very situational where you fight Chaos. So there's nothing predictable about it. Same strategies apply as with anybody else. Ambush works great. Lightning strikes can work great. Try to turn it, if you can outnumber your opponent, that can be great, and turn it into an attrition-based sort of slugfest. It can be very effective with Dwarves. Make sure to use Underway to avoid taking attrition when moving through corrupted territory. And that's basically it for Dwarves. Don't necessarily try to allow Chaos to engage you in Underway. Chaos is one of the only factions that will do fairly well against Dwarves in Underway. But other than that, there's very little to say there for Dwarves. There's not much specifics to deal with the Chaos Invasion, because the main thing you want to set up is to crush the Bjornlings, and after that you basically have free reign, because your economy is so powerful. You can throw entire armies away fighting Chaos, and you'll still come out on top. So, in short, quick recap of Dwarves. Build up your economy in early game, build up fortifications and growth, because that is where you will struggle the most. Make sure to run generally tier 3, initially tier 1 and 2 armies with a mix of Dwarf Warriors, Grudge Throwers, and Quarrelers, later upgrading into Thunders, Cannons, and Longbeards. You can mess around with high tier units, don't get me wrong, some of them are very fun to use. You can get Flame Cannons, Gyro Bombers. One of the tier 4 units I would recommend getting a few of are definitely Orkan Guns. They're one of the only tier 4 units that I find are particularly useful or nice for Dwarves to have. Otherwise, Iron Breakers are great, but fairly expensive. Not a bad unit by any means, but definitely just very expensive compared to Longbeards for what they do. Longbeards basically do the same job about as well. Well, not quite as well, but well enough. Hammers, not particularly useful except for assault armies or siege armies. Once again, that great weapon situation. And most of those units are very niche, but you can have fun with the high-end units. Make sure not to overextend. It's kind of hard to do with Dwarves. But make sure you leave a holding force when you push south early on, so that the orcs in Mount Gunbad can't get to you. And basically that's it for Dwarves. That should be all. If you follow these instructions, you basically be able to crush anything and everything in your path. I do hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below. I do hope you found it useful. If you have any suggestions on how I could improve these guides, make them more efficient, some things you think I missed or could be added, be sure to mention those down in the comments below. I'll be sure to read them, and hopefully if there's anything I missed, other people can pick it up and read it there. Once again, I appreciate you all for watching, and I'll be sure to do an Angren video within the next few days, which will be a shorter version of this, basically just covering the early game. So yeah, I appreciate you all for watching, and Wyvern out.